Chapter 25, SOS. Frantic that they would suffocate in the hot, stuffy attic, the four girls continued their efforts to break down the locked door. But finally they were forced to give up, their shoulders bruised and sore. Bess was on the verge of tears. In the darkness, the others could hear her moan softly. "Nobody will ever find us here." Nancy felt far from cheerful, but she tried to encourage her friends by saying that perhaps Mrs. Glick and Henner would bring help. "Oh, no, they won't," Bess wailed. "That awful man has probably captured them too by this time." Manda had not uttered a word, and Nancy asked her how she felt. "I'm all right," the Amish girl said. "But it is my fault that all of us are trapped here. I should have known Mr. Holt might return earlier, even though he told me evening. He rarely went anywhere in the daytime. He was always out at night." Nancy persuaded the girl that she was not to blame. But the young detective too felt bad because she had been so close to capturing the thief, then had lost her chance. George, practical as usual, pushed one of the tables to the wall directly under the ventilator. She climbed up to breathe in some fresh air and to investigate the ventilator as a means of escape. The bars were tightly built into the wall with 3-inch spaces between them. "No chance to get out this way," she said. "But if anybody feels faint, I suggest coming up here for a little air." "Maybe we can use the ventilator for another purpose," said Nancy. "We can signal for help." "With what?" Bess asked forlornly. Manda remembered having seen a kerosene lantern in the room. "Is that what you had in mind, Nancy? Using a light to signal with?" "Yes, Manda. You're becoming a good detective." The Amish girl found the lantern, then asked if anyone had a match. Nancy produced a packet from her dress pocket. Matches and a flashlight were part of her detective equipment, but this time the flashlight was in her stolen car. She lighted a match and Manda tested the lamp. "It's all right, and there's enough oil in it," the Amish girl stated. "It won't do any good to signal until it's dark," Bess spoke up. "And by that time, there's no telling what may happen to us." To pass the time, Nancy decided to try locating the secret drawers in the genuine Washington tables. As she worked, Nancy told Manda the story. But after a half-hour's search, Nancy had not found the drawers. "They're certainly well concealed," she said. Bess and George took turns but had no better luck. Suddenly, Nancy had a new idea. If the secret drawers were so hard to find, it was possible that the gypsy woman had not known about them. If she had secreted a note in one of the tables, it might well be in some other part of it. Nancy examined every inch of the 2 tables. Finally, it occurred to her that one of the legs looked just a trifle different in length. When she measured it with the other 3, using her skirt as a ruler, she found the leg to be about 1/16 of an inch longer than the others. Standing the table on its side, she began to wiggle the leg. After several tries, she felt it loosen slightly. Excitedly, Nancy twisted the leg and found that it actually unscrewed. In a moment, she had it off. Wedged inside was a small piece of paper. By this time, the other girls had jumped to her side. As they watched in astonishment, Nancy removed the note and read it as George held the lantern. "Emile, my beloved, someday our paths will cross again, but now I must flee. Wherever I am, my love and thoughts will always be for you. Before I leave, I want to warn you. Yesterday I learned the secret of your farm. I nearly stumbled into a deep hole located near a stand of oak trees. You know the place, for we have often met there. Had I been alone, I would have vanished like members of your family. But my brother Gatto rescued me. We wondered about the hole. He went down on a rope with a lantern and found a crystal cave. It is large and beautiful, and someday will bring you riches. I have planted bushes of wildflowers from the forest over the hole, so you will never fall in. This will prove my love for you. I beg you to leave your papa and find me. Your loving gypsy, Amaya. Speechless, the girls read and reread the note to themselves. At last, they knew the secret of the old Holt farm. Roger Holt will return here someday and find this, Bess said dejectedly. He will be a rich man, and all of us will be dead. George chided her cousin for such melancholy thoughts. We'll signal and get out of here yet, she said with determination. Fortunately, dusk came on early. Nancy climbed to the tabletop and held the lantern up to the ventilator. Passing one hand in front of the light at intervals, she gave the SOS signal. Over and over she repeated this until her arms were weary. George climbed up to relieve her, then Bess. They all knew the call. Manda marveled at such efficiency. I hope someone sees it soon and understands, she said. At this moment, the girls, hearing heavy footsteps on the attic steps, caught their breath. Was Roger Holt returning with reinforcements? Would the girls be further harmed? Would he now be the possessor of the secret in the table and take advantage of it? The key turned in the door. The girls stood together, ready to defend themselves. The door opened. To their relief, they saw 2 police officers in the doorway. They were state police officers, Wagner and Schmidt. "Oh, boy!" George cried out. "I never was more glad in my whole life to see anybody." "Were you giving an SOS signal?" Officer Wagner asked. "Yes," said Nancy, and quickly told how they had been imprisoned by Holt. Then she showed the policeman the note about the crystal cave. "I can hardly believe all this," said Officer Wagner. "Nancy Drew, it is remarkable how you have solved this mystery." "But it isn't completely solved," the girl detective replied. "We still have to find Mr. and Mrs. Holt. She said that possibly they were in her car, which had been stolen." "A very good deduction," said Officer Schmidt. "We haven't had any word that your convertible was picked up." As the whole group hurried down the stairs and went outdoors, Nancy asked the policeman if they had seen Mrs. Glick or her son Henner. "No," Officer Wagner answered. "Are they here too?" "I don't know," said Nancy, explaining that the Glicks had come to the Schnitz with the girls, but had stayed behind near the witch tree. "They may be prisoners," she said. "We'd better go there and look." They hurried along with the policemen, who beamed their bright flashlights ahead. As they approached the witch tree, the rays of light picked out the woman and her son, gagged and bound to the tree trunk. Quickly, the 2 were released. Then stories were exchanged. Mrs. Glick said that when Nancy had gone off, she and Henner had stayed behind to watch the deaf mute so he could make no trouble. "But he got away just before Mr. and Mrs. Holt drove in with Nancy's car," Mrs. Glick went on. "We tried to escape, but they caught us. They had another man with them." "I'll report all of this at once," said Officer Wagner. Over his shortwave car radio, he sent a message to headquarters, giving a full report and requesting that every road be covered until Mr. and Mrs. Holt and their companion were apprehended. Then he added, "We'll take Nancy Drew and her friends home before we return." Mrs. Glick wanted to take the horse and buggy, but the officer suggested that she leave them until morning. They all crowded into the officer's car, which was parked on one of the little-used roads. It was a long and bumpy ride back to the Glicks. On the way, Nancy, who was sitting in front between the two officers, asked what had brought them to the old Holt homestead. "You just didn't happen to be there to answer my signal," she said, a twinkle in her eye. The officers confessed that they had been making a very intensive checkup of Roger Holt. They had learned about the family homestead and had decided to go there and look around. "You were just in the nick of time," Bess spoke up. "I was nearly suffocated." Officer Wagner smiled. "I'm glad we found you, but that doesn't lessen the fact that it is Nancy Drew who solved this case." Nancy made no comment. As always happened when she had solved a mystery, she began to wonder what the next challenge would be. It was not long in coming, for at that very moment events were taking place that would enmesh the young detective in another exciting adventure, the hidden window mystery. The police officers kept their radio tuned to headquarters during the entire drive. To everyone's elation, the news was flashed to them a little later that Mr. and Mrs. Holt and their accomplice had been arrested. They had been caught riding in Nancy's car, which would be returned to its owner at the Glick home. The broadcast went on to say that Roger Holt had confessed to having posed as an Amish man from Ohio. In his childhood, he had lived in Lancaster, and so had learned the customs and language of these people. Therefore, it had been easy for him to pose as one of them. Holt admitted that when Nancy found out he had taken the Follett furniture, he had tried in every way to keep her from locating him. He had resorted both to violence and to defamation of her character. The witch tree symbol was his undoing, the police officer announced on the shortwave radio. Holt had copied his family's old hex sign on a piece of paper and lost it at the Follett home when he stole the furniture. When he came back to look for it, Nancy and Mrs. Tenney surprised him there, and he had fled to the second floor. Hearing of Nancy's plan to search the house, he had run away and checked out of the hotel. 3 days before this, he had made a phone call to his accomplice in Lancaster, saying he was ready for the man to bring his truck and steal the antique furniture. The evening of the day when Nancy had surprised him in the Follett mansion, Holt had planned to spy on the Drew home. While cruising back and forth in his car, he had seen a chance to hit Togo and had done this out of spite. Later that evening, he had phoned Mrs. Tenney. Disguising his voice, he had posed as an antique dealer from New York and had cleverly induced Mrs. Tenney to tell all she knew about Nancy's part in the case, including the fact that she was going to Lancaster to try to find the thief. Hearing this, Holt had at once started for Lancaster. On the way, he had mailed the warning letter in Montville. Holt, on a trip back to Lancaster after his release from prison, had heard about the secret in the old table. Since the secret was reputed to have some connection with the old Holt property, he had seen a chance of finding a treasure, acquiring the property cheap, and then becoming wealthy. From the time he had learned Nancy had taken the case, he had worked against her, trying to keep her from locating him. "But he failed," cried Manda, leaning forward to hug Nancy. "If you had not come to Amish country, I would not now be going home to my parents. Oh, I am so happy to have met a wonderful person like you." Nancy smiled and returned the compliment as Manda dropped her voice confidentially. "I will tell you 3 girls a secret," she said. "I met a fine young man in Lancaster who wants to marry me in a month. Papa and Mama will like him too, and I know they will give me a big wedding. Nancy, George, and Bess, you will promise to come, please?" "We'd love to!" exclaimed Nancy, as George said, "You couldn't keep us away." Sounds dreamy, Bess said with delight. And you Amish have wonderful wedding feasts, she chuckled. Ain't? The end.